Hey everybody! Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are going to look at the image texture and some useful and fun things we can do with it. We're going to start by using a height map to displace a grid. Then we're going to look at using a black and white image to control an instance on points node to control where our instances are placed. We're also going to use an RGB map to instance separate objects according to the colors in the RGB map. And then we're going to scale some instances using an image, and then tie back that image's color to create a 3D representation of the image. The image texture is available both in geometry nodes and in the shader editor. Let's open up a shader editor here so that we can look at some of the various properties of this node. We'll start by adding an image texture. We can choose an image or an animated clip. We'll choose an image for now and come back to a clip in just a bit. Now let's hook up the color to the base color of our BSDF. We'll also use the rendered mode on our 3D viewport so we can see the effects we're examining. Next, we're going to add mapping and texture coordinates by using Ctrl-T. If you have Node Wrangler installed in your add-ons. It does come with Blender, it's just a simple check of a box to enable. But if you don't want to do that, just add the mapping and texture coordinate nodes. We're going to use the generated socket from the texture coordinate into the vector socket of the mapping. Now we can see our image present on the cube. We're also going to add a bump node and run our image color through the height of that node and then into the normal to give our image a bit more dimension. Now let's talk about the interpolation, which is set here. As you can see, the options are linear, cubic, closest, and smart. These are used when scaling images up or down for rendering. Linear is the regular quality interpolation, while cubic is a bit smoother and better quality. The manual does suggest this mode of interpolation for use with bump maps. Closest will have no interpolation and can be useful for pixel art. And Smart, which is available in cycles only, uses cubic interpolation when scaling up, and when scaling down it uses linear. Next, let's look at projection modes. These control how the image is projected onto your object. Flat, as you can see here, projects the image on the top and bottom of our cube, but extends the edges straight down, forming lines. If we set this to box, we get a copy of our image on each face of our cube. If we select sphere, we can see that our image is stretched over the cube as if it were a sphere, distorting our image some. If we choose tube, that will wrap our image around the sides and then extend the edge colors on the top and bottom to meet in the center. This does stretch our image horizontally. Now let's adjust the scale of our z-axis on the mapping node and move it to somewhere around 3 so that we can see our extrapolation settings. On repeat, the default, the image is repeated just over 3 times. If we choose Extend instead, we see only one image, with the edge color extending all the way up from it. The clip setting will remove any additional images or colors, and we can see that both the top and bottom of our cube are now black. If we mirror the image, it will mirror this image to the image above it, and likewise mirror that image back to the original for the image above it. We've been looking at a single image, but now let's bring in a movie clip. Let's scale our Z back to 1 so we can look at the settings without that distraction. You can see that when we choose our movie clip, that this drop-down automatically adjusted to movie. Now let's look at the movie-specific settings. The frames will dictate how many frames of your animation will be included. Let's set this to 100. If your animation has more frames than the current file's frame count, your clip will be cut off at the end frame, no matter how high you set this. It will not scale the frames to fit within your current file. We also need to enable auto refresh to be able to see our movie render in the 3D viewport. We can also specify a different start frame from the default one. This will control which frame in the current animation will start the clip playing. If we set this to 20, we can see our animation pause between frames 0 and 20, and then start as usual. The offset can be used to specify a later frame in the clip where we want to start. Let's set our start frame back to 1 and set the offset to 50. Now we can see our animation starting in a different spot than before. The cyclic checkbox will make our animation repeat if it's shorter than our current animation, or we have the frame set lower. The color space should be set to the same setting that the original file was saved in. You can see that we have a wide variety of options available here. The alpha options will be available if your image format supports transparency, and it controls how the image will use the alpha channel. Now that we've looked at some of the settings, let's see some practical examples of how we can use this node in the Geometry Nodes modifier. Let's go to the Geometry Nodes workspace, and we'll start by adding a new Geometry Node modifier on the default cube. We're going to start by working with height maps, and you can get an actual height map from Tangrams. I'll link to the site below. You can zoom in to any location and generate a height map. Let's zoom in, and then where we find a location we like, we can click the render button, and this will generate and download a height map. Now let's head back into Blender. We can delete the group input, and let's add a mesh primitive grid. We'll hook this up to our output node, and then let's configure our grid to be a little larger with more vertices. And this is the height map we will be using today. This is one that I downloaded prior to this video. Next, we're going to add a UV unwrap node. We'll need this for our image to map correctly. Next, we'll add an image texture, and we'll hook the UV socket up to the vector socket on the image texture. Now let's use the folder icon to open our height map image. Next, we'll add a set position node, which will allow us to displace our mesh. Before we hook this up, we're going to add a separate XYZ and a combine XYZ. We'll plug the color information into the separate node from our image texture. And we only want to bring over the Z information for our displacement, so we'll hook that up here. Now let's plug our combine XYZ into the offset socket of the set position node. Let's move these nodes over and bring in a math node so we can scale our displacement. We'll first set the math node to multiply, and then put this in between our separate and combine XYZ nodes. We can then adjust this as needed until we get the right look on our mesh. If you want to smooth out some of these more drastic peaks, you can add more vertices to your mesh. Next, we're going to look at how we can create a path in the woods using a simple black and white image. The path will be where the black portion is, and this white area will contain our trees, which in this example will be represented by simple cones. Let's go ahead and load our image, and with the current displacement, we can immediately see that all of the white areas are displaced on the Z, while the black areas remain unaffected. We'll go ahead and get rid of our separate XYZ, combine XYZ, and math nodes. Let's also get rid of our set position node, since we are not going to displace our mesh. We're going to add a distribute points on faces node, and put that between our grid and the output. Let's hook up an instance on points node just after the distribute points on faces node. Now let's add a cone for our instance to represent trees. We can adjust the radius and height of our cones a bit so that they fit better in our scene. We'll hook our color directly into the density of the distribute points on faces node. Now we can see our path. But let's go ahead and bring in another math node, and again set this to multiply. And we can see that as we increase our multiplier, the density of our trees also increases, and our path becomes more visible. Next, we're going to be using this RGB image to map out various instances in our scene. We'll control instantiation of different objects based on the color. Let's go ahead and open that image in the image texture. Next, we are going to need a join geometry node at the end so that we can output all of our instances. We want to add a separate color node, which will separate out the red, blue, and green channels. We also need a map range so we can remove some of these outlier instances that are appearing outside the bounds of our red areas. We can move up the From Min to exclude some of those outliers, and we can adjust the To Max to increase the amount of cones in our red zones. We can also adjust the number of cones with the Multiply node. And if we bump up our From Min once more, we can see the last of the outliers disappear. Now that we have our cones limited to the red zones, let's map some instances to our green zone. We'll start by duplicating our Distribute Points on Faces and Instance on Points nodes. Let's add an icosphere for our instance object. And we'll plug the Instance on Points node into the Join Geometry node. Next, we'll bring the Grid Mesh into our Distribute Points on Faces node. Now let's adjust the size of our icospheres, and then we can filter them to the green zone. Let's add another Map Range node, and we can bring the green socket into the value. Then we can plug the Map Range result into the Density socket of the Distribute Points on Faces node. Let's adjust our Map Range node until we see our spheres nicely distributed in the green zone. We can add another Math Multiply node to increase the amount of our spheres here. And we can adjust that multiple value up until we are happy with our distribution of points. Now all that remains is our blue zone. Once again, let's duplicate the Distribute Points on Faces and Instance on Points nodes. This time, let's use a cube for our instance object. Then we'll hook these nodes into our Join Geometry and Grid Mesh as we did last time. And we need to adjust our cube size as well. I'll bring mine down to 0.1 meters cubed. Now let's add another map range for our blue channel. And we'll take the blue output and hook that into the value for this map range. And we'll go ahead and plug that straight into our Density socket on the Distribute Points on Faces node. Let's increase our From Min a bit. And then let's increase our To Max to increase the number of cubes we have. Let's actually go over and increase our cube size to 0.2 meters to make our geometry a little more visible. Now let's do one other thing with this example. Let's assign some colors based on the location within our RGB map. Let's head over to our Materials tab in the Properties editor to generate a few simple materials. First, let's create a red color and name it Red. Then we'll add a green color and name it something crazy like Green. Finally, let's add a blue color named Blue. Now we can add a Set Material node, and we'll duplicate that twice for our other outputs. Let's also switch to Rendered Mode or Material Preview if you prefer, so we can see our colors as we assign them. We'll use red for the red zones, green for the green zone, and blue for the blue zone. Now we can see all of our zones mapped correctly to object color. You may need to play around with your map range settings a bit to get the mapping exactly right. Let's take a look at the image we started with for comparison. Next, we are going to look at how to use an artistic image to control scale and color of our objects. We'll delete a lot of our existing nodes, just leaving our grid, image, and instance on points. Let's change our instance to a cube. Let's open a more artistic image. In my case, I'm going to use a Vincent van Gogh self-portrait. We can also remove this Distribute Points on Faces node, as we will not be utilizing it here. Next, let's add a Map Range node, and we'll plug our color directly into the value socket in the map range node. Then we're going to take the result of the map range and plug that directly into the scale socket of our instance on points node. We can immediately see that our image is recognizable. But we can also adjust our map range values a bit to affect the range of sizes that our cubes become. And we can see that we have a 3D effect where the lighter portions of the painting are. Let's head over to our shading workspace and add a new material. We'll add an image texture node over here, and we'll select our Van Gogh portrait from the drop-down. We will then plug this directly into our base color, then use Ctrl-T to add the mapping and texture coordinate nodes as we did before. We'll use the generated value to join our vector socket of the mapping node. Like I mentioned earlier, if you do not have Node Wrangler enabled, you can enable it here under Edit, Preferences. It comes with Blender by default, but is not enabled by default. If you want to, you can also just add the nodes manually. Let's name our new color Image Color. Then we can head back to the Geometry Nodes workspace. Now let's add our Set Material node and select the image color we just created. The reason this doesn't look right yet is because our individual image is being created on each individual cube. To resolve this, we need to add a Realize Instances node. And now we have our portrait. And we can adjust our map range some more to scale up or down our instances to see more or less of the painting. We can also see that our three-dimensional aspects are preserved, so the lighter portions of the painting will result in larger cubes. That's going to wrap up today's discussion of the Image Texture node. I hope you found this useful and informative. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, or just want to say hi, please leave those in the comments section. Please give me a like or maybe subscribe if you'd like to help support my channel. I thank you for watching, and I wish you a very happy blendering.